Hello, and a warm welcome to the Bookshelf, where we discuss new books relevant to the study of contemporary South Asia. I'm your host, Dr. Imran Ahmed, a visiting research fellow here at ISAS. Today, we'll be discussing the book Ruttie Jinnah The Woman Who Stood Defiant, written by Dr. SAAD S KHAN and Sarah S. Khan. The book is a biographical study of an enigmatic, significant, but understudied historical figure in South Asian history, written by Mariam Jinnah, who was the wife of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The book reconstructs Ruttie's complex personality, her relationship with and marriage to Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and the details of her private, social, and political life. The narrative also provides something of a social, intellectual, and political history of colonial India in the early part of the 20th century. Ruttie Jinnah, The Woman Who Stood Defiant, describes Ruttie as an ardent anti-colonialist, a fierce nationalist, and a staunch supporter of women's equality, the rule of law, and religious harmony. The book asks important questions pertaining to the freedom movement and Muhammad Ali Jinnah's political life. Did Ruttie impact the creation of Pakistan? Did she influence her husband and have a posthumous influence on Pakistan's polity? Does her legacy still affect Indo-Pak relations? We're most grateful to have Dr. Saad here today to talk to us about this most interesting and provoking work. Dr. Saad is a historian and a political scientist. He is a faculty member of the National School of Public Policy in Lahore, Pakistan. Dr. Saad was a Cambridge OSI Trust Scholar at the University of Cambridge in the UK and a Fulbright non-degree professional scholar at the Institute of Training and Development in the US. Dr. Saad, welcome to the Bookshelf.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Dr. Saad, while much has been written about Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Pakistan's founding father and first Governor General, little is known about his first and only wife, Rattanbai Mariam Jinnah. Who was Ruttie Jinnah and why did you decide to take on this book project?
Right, that's very interesting question, actually. You are very right. Hundreds of books have been written about Muhammad Ali Jinnah and probably thousands of articles. And the person who most impacted the life and thoughts of Jinnah, that is his wife, Rattanbai Mariam Jinnah, she has been understudied. There may be many reasons, some family related, some historical, but the bottom line is that she was studied much, and her persona was such that I think that she deserved to be written about, and that is something that was amiss. That was something which was even missing from the historiography of the first half of the 20th century British India. Many of the founding fathers of freedom movement and Pakistan, India, for example, Jawaharlal Nehru wrote his own autobiography. Gandhi ji, the story of his my experiences with Booth, he wrote his own autobiography. Jinnah didn't find time enough. Had he found some time, he would have written a lot about his wife, I guess. But what I know is from my studies that Jinnah was very keen to be written about. He wanted somebody, some historians, to write about him and give the facts about him and his life to the people. And he would say in his last days that I couldn't find time, and he was very ill in the final days, as we all know. So that's I think that left a void about the private life of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. His public life was, very easy to be studied. His statements, his, political actions, they were all there. I mean, all around, and we could easily decipher what his thoughts from his political thoughts, and as they evolved from being a Indian nationalist to what I call a bi-nationalist, his two-nation theory that India was not, a single nation, but consisted of two nations. So that was easy. But Muhammad Ali Jinnah is a person. His love life, for example, his children, his wife, his relation with the in-laws, his heart, I mean, very tender heart. That is something that we study. We peep into his heart through the lens of Mrs. Jinnah. So how I came about thinking about writing on Mrs. Jinnah. Actually, it was a conference held to mark the 60th anniversary of the independence of Pakistan and India. That was around 2007, because as you know, partition and independence took place in 1947. And the National Institute of Historical and Cultural Research in Pakistan asked the scholars, I was one of them, to write on some understudied figure in Indo-Pak freedom history. So everybody knows about Jinnah and Nehru and Gandhi and Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So I had heard or read about a couple of instances of Mrs. Jinnah, her repartee with the viceroy, and she being very witty. So I thought that I would read a paper of 15 to 20 minutes at that conference. And for 1 month, I couldn't find enough stuff to speak for 15 minutes. I did speak, at this conference, but that made my determination to find out more about this lady, because life had been unkind to her. She died very young. She was very ill in her final days. So if life had been unkind to her, at least history shouldn't have been. So that was my motto when I thought of writing about her. Yeah.
In the preface of your book, you noted that the feat of writing a dispassionate and scholarly study of her life was a Herculean task. Can you tell us about the challenges you faced as a historian in reconstructing her life and writing her biography? I think you mentioned here that you couldn't find enough materials to simply do a 15-minute presentation.
Yeah, and that was something that made the task Herculean. Actually, you wanted to write about somebody who was very influential during her time. She was known to Gandhiji. She was known to Prime Minister Nehru. There were 18 accounts of biographies of people who knew her, and not one of them fails to mention her. Jawaharlal Nehru, his sister Krishna Bhuti Singh, she wrote V. Nehru's as her autobiography. Jawaharlal Nehru's other sister, Pandit, Mrs. Pandit, she wrote The Scope of Happiness, and there were so many books, and nobody could miss her. Even biographies or autobiographies written 50 years after the death of Mrs. Jinnah. When somebody talks about Mr. Jinnah, he or she would also talk about Mrs. Jinnah. So she was noticed by everybody, by the viceroys, by so many people. I mean, she was only 21 years of age when Congress offered her to become the vice president of All India Trade Union Congress, which was the uh, labor wing and traders wing of All India Congress. And the other person being offered the vice presidentship was Diwan Chaman Lal, who was a very mature and senior politician at that time. So she must have made her mark in her late teens. That Motilal Nehru, Jawaharlal's father, personally knew her enough to get her communicated to offer the offer of vice presidentship. And but there was no, in my view, no particular compilation of her history. No single book who would describe her from birth to death, and especially her, posthumous legacy. So that was what I thought about doing, and it became very difficult. And it was, the scarcity of material was just one aspect, because you would read a whole book. I mean, an autobiography of some prominent figure of the early 20th century British India. And out of 400 pages, you would find 3 lines about her, but those 3 lines would be very important, very unique, and give a different aspect or a different incident or a different event about her life. So that was one thing, that you had to piece together this jigsaw puzzle from so many different sources over so many years, and that was, of course, a Herculean task. But the major problem, I think, is in the past 10 or 12 years. I mean, the Indian government, the right-wing government, the Pakistan government is the right-wing, version of Pakistani politics. And the narratives that had always been there, but they were contested narratives about the freedom movement. I mean, But today, it's very difficult to deviate from that narrative. So if there is an Indian narrative that Jinnah was not a good person and he was a divisive personality and everything that he did was wrong, it was easier to contest or challenge that narrative in books in 1960s and 70s, both in India and Pakistan. Or if there is some narrative in Pakistan of Jinnah being a very religious person and who wanted to found an Islamic state as opposed to quote unquote a Muslim state, which is very different, by the way. It would have been easier, let's say 20 years ago, to say that or to write that. But now the freedom of expression has become very much limited in India and Pakistan. Uh, the political forces or the religious forces, which were at the margins of the mainstream in India and Pakistan, have become so central that they literally force the scholars and writers and analysts to towards self-censorship. And it's very, very difficult to write what you want to write. Now, just to say or to portray Mrs. Jinnah as a progressive lady um, and try to navigate your wording in a way that you won't be, labeled as a traitor. I'm not saying that every writer is at the threat of being lynched in India or Pakistan, but after all, few people are beaten up or lynched in those two countries, and that results in the remaining 999 people doing so much self-censorship that ordinary people in Pakistan do not know that there is another opinion about Jinnah that exists, or there is another way of looking Jinnah and his family relationships or his political outlook, because now it becomes from being a dominant narrative to the narrative, where no opposite narrative is available. So, I mean, in that circumstances, I have to confess that I had to do some self-censorship, because if as there is a Turkish saying, every truth is not said everywhere. Because truth, to say the truth, you have to find the right environment. For example, if your book gets banned in Pakistan or in India or both, then you end up doing a disservice to history, despite being a historian. So you have to know your red lines. Now, that would have been very easy if I had been sitting in any developed country, in Singapore, Australia, or UK, or America, United States, where, I mean, at least there was not a personal threat involved. I mean, I live here, my kids go to school here, and, there's so many things which we have to confess, because if we don't raise these issues anywhere, then they will continue. And the third major issue was about mobility between India and Pakistan. It took about 6 months to get an Indian visa to do some research about this book. Otherwise, it should have taken 7 days. But what is more interesting is that it took another 1 year and a quarter for my government to allow me to go to India, once a visa had been stamped on my passport. So when you line up certain number of interviews there and things, they end up going nowhere, because how many times you can email the other person that, okay, I'm not coming in the next month, maybe I will come in the next 6 months, assuming that that person has nothing to do and he has no plans of life and he would be staying in Bombay forever till I land in Bombay. That doesn't happen that way. So there is a glass ceiling for all historians working on politics or religion or history in South Asia, or I mean, in the developing world. I mean, that goes for Iran or goes for Saudi Arabia, or that will go for Libya or Mali, for example. That's a glass ceiling. I mean, if there are very few Olympic gold medals obtained by South Asian athletes, or at so less patents and so less Nobel prizes, it's not that there is some biological problem with being an Asian or being an African. There is such a glass ceiling. There are so many impediments. If I, for example, apply for a US visa to do some research, it will take 1 year, and then I may be stamped a visa for 7 days. In this atmosphere, it's not very easy to produce an output in sports or sciences or history that one would like to. So every historian is operating in an ecosystem, which is very challenging, I would say. So that's why I called it Herculean.
In my next question, I think you touched on that just a little bit beforehand, saying that that Ruttie had a difficult life. She was
Mm-hmm.
born in February 1900. And just as her life was difficult, her life span also straddled across a very difficult and defining and turbulent time in
Mm-hmm.
colonial India.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could tell us about her family, social milieu, and the social and political context of her upbringing and early life.
That's very interesting, actually. Actually, every human being is the product of his or her times. For example, if Muhammad Ali Jinnah had been born 100 years earlier, probably he wouldn't have married Ruttie Jinnah. Why? Because Ruttie Jinnah was a Shian, the lone and eldest daughter of a very rich and influential family in British India. Her family had been granted the baronetcy. Her father was Sir Dinshaw Pettit II, the Dinshaw Pettit, the second baron. And the family was knighted. I mean, the title of Sir. The family was one of the richest who could afford spending summer vacations in French Riviera, where they had their own palace, which very few Indians, probably none of the British viceroys, had a private palace in the French Riviera on the Mediterranean. So, and they were very, central figures in the Parsi community of Bombay, the Pettit family. Now, belonging to two very rich families, the confluence of two, her paternal and maternal families, the Pettit family, the paternal family, and Gigi Bhai family, from the maternal side, both were, very prominent and influential figures, families in British India, not only in Bombay. Now, Jinnah himself had made a name. By the age of 40, he was known all over. I mean, you go through Bombay Chronicle or any of the leading newspapers of that time, he was there on the front page almost every other day. That was about 30 years before the creation of Pakistan. He had made his name. And he was amongst the 10 richest investors of British India. Muhammad Ali Jinnah's main source of income was not his legal fees, which were amongst the highest, by the way, at 1,500 rupees a day. But he was a very shrewd investor in properties and stock exchange and factories. And he was a shareholder of Bombay Electric and Wadia Industries and so many. So he was amongst, the Bank of India had an annual list of, 10 of the richest investors of the country. And Jinnah usually figured among at number 5 or number 4 for many consecutive years over around 2 decades. So he was a well-known person. And there was what I call an Islamic reformation taking place. You know, uh, for Muslims, where the face veil or face parda was a routine for women, and every house had a Zanan Khana, which is the women's quarter, and a Mardan Khana, which was a men's quarter, and men and women were not allowed to intermingle. Gradually, things were changing. The thoughts of Aga Khan, the spiritual leader of the Ismaili community, who came out all against veil. Ataturk in Turkey, who literally banned face veil and the fez caps. So even in India, there was a transformation taking place. Because whatever was happening in Indonesia, or whatever Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan was saying within India, or whatever Ataturk was saying in Turkey, Muslim society was gradually moving towards modernization. Now, in that context, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the modern person, could find acceptability, which would not have been possible in 1850s or 1810, for example. Just like, the Reformation, etc., took place in Europe in 2 to 3 centuries. Muslim world had started by 1900s, early 1900s, and will continue for another 100 or 150 years. Because one lifespan of 60 to 70 to 80 years is too short to know that I am passing through Reformation. So I think somebody in 2250 would say that the years 1900 to 2100 were the defining period in Muslims' transformation towards a modern, forward-looking, progressive community. And so that was the social and cultural construct in which Jinnah and Mrs. Jinnah could lead the Muslim community, and the religious right-wing cleric-dominated parties were shunned out. So that was one sort of side of the social environment. Another thing was the technical revolution taking place. When Jinnahs were married, gradually the horse-drawn carts were being replaced by cars in British India. Electricity was for the first time direct current, not alternating current as we have now. The direct current operated fans and electric lights were making their way into Bombay, into India, and Jinnah's home was amongst the first ones to have all the modern amenities. And when we look at the life of Mrs. Jinnah, we actually see all the transformation. We see so much thing. I mean, in Mrs. Jinnah's life, that we get a peep into the social changes taking place and the technological changes taking place at that time. And the last point I would like to highlight is that the tens and twenties and early 30s one was an age of euphoria, where somehow there was an impression that freedom was just around the corner. So, I mean, if Gandhi ji announced non-cooperation movement in 1922, or the SALT March in 1930, and Quit India movement much later in 1940, because they thought that okay, the imperial forces need just one more push. So when we try to understand Mrs. Jinnah, we have to have all this cultural and social context in mind.
Thank you so much. So it sounds like she came from a place of tremendous wealth and privilege, but also straddled a time of considerable change. This leads me to the next question. Amongst the most provocative aspects about the book is its very title, The Woman Who Stood Defiant. What did Mrs. Jinnah defy? What do we know about her politics and political life?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, yes, that was a provocative title that exactly defines, in my opinion, her provocative character. I mean, she just loved to provoke people. For example, when she would go in a Congress setting and there was a political fad to be donned in white, homespun cotton, and so on, and she would be donned in the most daring clothes to provoke everybody. That okay, you think that this is a political passport to success, shunning Western clothes, and here I am, and my way of defying the British is to be dressed equal to them, comparable to them. So that was her way of provoking, whosoever she wanted to provoke, actually. Mrs. Jinnah defied so many things that defiance became her signature identity. First of all, she defied her parents because she wanted to marry a person 24 years her senior, a lawyer from a different community, that is Muslims, which was, despite the modernity in the Parsi community, they were at least not that modern that they would take it lightly that a person of Parsi descent would be marrying a Muslim or a Hindu. And so she defied the whole society. The Parsi Panchayat declared that anybody, even her parents or brothers, she had 3 brothers, who would talk to her would be expelled from Parsi community, and they would be denied even funeral rites of Parsis if they die after having met her. And so she was cut off from her brothers, her family, her cousins, everybody, her family, her cousins, everybody she knew in a circle. But she stood defiant. But when she married into Islam, she was not going to be coyed by mullahs who would now say that, okay, you wear the veil or something. She would be dressed the way she wanted to. And she would come on the stage in the Muslim League gatherings, which was the dominant political force among the Muslims. And she would even defy Jinnah when she thought that he was not giving her enough time. She just moved out of the house into the Taj Hotel, the very famous Taj Hotel, the iconic building on the seafront in Bombay, now called Mumbai. So whenever she thought that, okay, this is not the way I am going to go about, this is not something I agree with, she had the courage to defy. So once she met the viceroy at a dinner, and the viceroy was just, talking about Germany. He said, "I'm so fond of Germany. I wish I could go there." Mrs. Jinnah said, "Then why didn't you go there, Your Excellency?" He said, "The Germans don't like us." And Mrs. Jinnah said, "Then why is Your Excellency here in India?" So she meant that British are equally disliked in India. And she could say it to the face of the sitting viceroy. So if she thought, somebody said to her that, what if Jinnah is knighted, he is given the title of sir, and you would be called Lady Jinnah, what would you do? She said, I will divorce him right away. So it was a love marriage, but she didn't think for a second. So somebody so strong in character, so strong in her convictions, that was the beauty of her personality. And that's something that I think understood not only her political role. There are so many things. For example, she was a staunch feminist, and she did a lot. I have written a whole chapter in my book about brothels in Bombay to ameliorate the sufferings of those who were forced into prostitution, not those who adopted this as a profession. And against child prostitution, or against cruelty to animals that used to take place in the animal shelters called Pinjra poles at that time. So whatever she thought was right, she would stand by it. And whatever the society say or the politics would dictate, she didn't care. So that's how I thought about the title, The Woman Who Stood Defiant.
That's so interesting. It sounds like she was a person who really spoke her mind and stood what she meant for.
Yeah.
So I wanted to probe into her relationship with Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Her union is described. Her union with Jinnah is described in your book as the marriage that shook India. The details you provide paint a picture of quite a turbulent relationship, and yet Ruttie remained Jinnah's one and only great love. Where were the why were the Jinnahs such a controversial couple, and what was her influence on Jinnah and thereby on the creation of Pakistan itself?
Okay, I mean, the celebrity couples have to pay the price of being celebrities. So it is true of, Prince Charles and Prince Diana, and, Prime Minister Nehru and Kamala Nehru, and, so many in the showbiz and Bollywood. This is the price you have to pay. Actually, ups and downs are there in every relationship. In every human relationship. I would not exactly characterize the whole relationship as turbulent. What I would qualify it as the last 13 months of the life being turbulent. Because when she was ill in the final days, Jinnah was on her bedside for all 5 months in Champs-Élysées in a hospital in France, in Paris. The letter she wrote from her deathbed, which I've reproduced its image in my book, a handwritten letter, that speaks of extreme emotional love for Jinnah. But yes, there were differences in the final days or final months, I would say. Mrs. Jinnah wanted more time and more affection and more romance in the marriage. She was pretty young compared to Jinnah himself. Jinnah had a different personality. He meant business even in his marital relations. He expected the wife to be, with him on his political journeys and campaigns, but sometimes the wife has a right to expect a rose at the bedside, which was not the Jinnah sort. Something that a romantic Mrs. Jinnah. She was so fond of poetry. She was so fond of nature. She was so fond of romantic novels, and at one time she even contemplated becoming a poet or a novelist. And so there were two different personalities. The love did not abate. That was there. But yes, there were, the love was so intense that expectations from each other were pretty high. So that's probably the reason that The final few months were very turbulent for the couple. And I think, and I don't think actually, there are so many direct accounts of immediate family friends like Kanji Davarka Das or Mrs. Sarojini Naidu, who say that they would have made up had Mrs. Jinnah lived a little longer. Mrs. Jinnah died at the age of 29, and that's the most tragic part of it. And whenever Jinnah would remember her, even 10 years after her death, 20 years after her death, and tears would start trickling from his eyes. So they never, at least Jinnah never forgot her till his last day. And the opposition parties, among the Muslims at least, the right-wing parties, Majlis-e-Ahrar and Khaksar Tehreek and Jamiat-e-Ulama-e-Hind, did not let him forget, because the electoral cycle was 3 years for the Central Legislative Assembly, and whenever elections would be near, all the Muslim parties would start criticizing Mrs. Jinnah's dress and Mrs. Jinnah's demeanor and everything. They would bring her out of the grave to criticize her, because that was Jinnah's weak point. He couldn't take a flack about his wife, and that made him sad. So she continued to live in each political cycle of electoral cycle of 3 years.
Just on to my last question. We're almost out of time. I wanted to ask, for those interested in South Asian history, why is the story of Ruttie Jinnah so important? How is it relevant to us today, and what do you think is her legacy?
Right. So there are a number of ways she's important. She personifies the ideal, bold, feminist South Asian woman. She is a woman who can be celebrated on both sides of the divide, of the religious divide, of the political divide, of the nation-state divide, Pakistan and India. Because when we divided, in 1947, we divided roughly everything. Not only the physical assets and the military assets and the the revenues or the amount in the Bank of India, but also we divided our heroes, we divided our national days, we divided everything that we used to share together. For example, there used to be a kite festival, Basant, which was unique to the city of Lahore, and suddenly after partition, 50 years after partition, we found out that it was only for the Hindus to celebrate, and since we are Pakistanis, we couldn't. And things like that. Mrs. Jinnah still remains a personality, which if in India, road is named after her in Delhi, in Mumbai, for example, I don't think there's anybody going to mind. Very recently, about 10 or 12 years ago, there was a Lajpat Rai road named in Lahore, and nobody objected, because the personality of Lala Lajpat Rai was so tall that it hardly mattered whether he was a Hindu or a Muslim, as long as he was celebrated on both sides as a freedom fighter. So she is one of the figures as a starting point who can bridge the divide. That's one thing. The second thing is that she had an indirect hand in the creation of Pakistan, and that's very interesting. Because she never said Pakistan should be created, and by the time she died, the word Pakistan had not been coined, and neither was Jinnah very keen on having. He coined his two-nation theory gradually, but when their courtship started, Muhammad Ali Jinnah was known as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity, and he wanted India to remain united. But what happened was that the greatest opportunity to keep India united came about in 1927-28. Because when the Simon Commission arrived, there were certain other developments. For example, Delhi Muslim proposals that Jinnah had given were accepted by the Congress. And that was probably the last opportunity to hold India together. And Mrs. Jinnah became ill, and Jinnah remained away and disconnected from whatever was happening in India for better part of the year in 1928. Congress rescinded its acceptance of Delhi Muslim proposals of 1927. And then were so many things that had Jinnah been here in India, his towering personality would have managed to find some way, to bring together the politicians from both sides. So that's one of the things, that indirectly Mrs. Jinnah's influence, because she fell ill and Jinnah was out of the scene for so long, that created a rift that could never be bridged in the remaining 18 years that India remained united. There are many other ways which, for paucity of time, I can tell that in certain indirect ways, unconscious ways, Mrs. Jinnah's death also contributed to the creation of Pakistan. But my last point is that Mrs. Jinnah's persona, her being the one and only wife of Mr. Jinnah and the only love of Mr. Jinnah, is one of the reasons that Pakistan did not become so, misogynist society as certain other nations on the right, left of Pakistan have become, the Muslim nations. I don't want to name them because that would become very, very controversial. But it's not a coincidence that the first ever Muslim woman prime minister out of 57 Muslim countries came from Pakistan. It's not a coincidence that the first ever direct presidential election where one of the two candidates were a woman, Ayub Khan in 1965 presidential election in Pakistan, versus Fatima Jinnah, the sister of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, took place in Pakistan. It took United States of America 50 years to 2016, when one of the two leading contestants between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton was a woman. So in Pakistan, it was 50 years earlier that happened. Although Fatima Jinnah lost, so did Hillary Clinton, by the way. But one of the two candidates was a woman. So Mrs. Jinnah's legacy for women equality was there at least in the earlier decades of Pakistan's existence. And as Pakistan and India and certain other societies have swung towards more bigoted understanding of social relations, so the first casualty was Mrs. Jinnah. She was obliterated from history because you couldn't have her and defend whatever you are now doing to the women in this country. So that's my take on it.
Dr. Saad, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for joining us at the BookShelf.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.